So I've been thinking a little bit about the Ten Commandments, and I think when we read Exodus 20, which is one of the first places that we find the Ten Commandments written down, we actually see a lot of grace there, because right before God gives the Ten Commandments, he says, "I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt." And for God to say to Israel that I'm your God is also for him to say that you are mine. And before God ever gave the law, he delivered them out of Egypt. So it really was grace all the time. God delivered his people before the law. And even the law itself is a form of grace. You don't have a law from Zeus or Marduk or Ra. Those are some of the other ancient gods. Or God didn't write his law on sand and then the next day erase it and write a new law. The fact that God writes his law on stone means, number one, he took the time to tell humanity what he wanted them to do. That's an act of grace. He wrote it on stone because he's not a God who's going to change what he wants. He wants one thing today and something else tomorrow. And secondly, a lot of the ancient people who worshipped other gods, they actually longed for their gods to give them a law because they didn't know how to please them. So for Yahweh to give a law is an act of grace. And once again, he delivered his people before he even gave a law. So, before he said, "Thou shalt have no other gods," God was saying to Pharaoh, "Thou shalt not have my people." Before he ever made the commandment that you shouldn't make false gods, God was making a fool out of the false gods of Egypt. Before he ever said, "Don't take my name in vain," he was in a burning bush saying, "My name is I am who I am." Before he ever said, "Keep the Sabbath day holy," God was making a path in the wilderness to give a Sabbath rest to people who were enslaved. Before he ever said, "Don't murder and shed innocent blood," God told the Israelites to paint blood on the doorpost and he'd pass over the blood. Before he ever said, "Honor your father and mother," God was honoring his covenant with Abraham. Before God ever said, "Don't steal," he was plundering Egypt on Israel's behalf. Before God ever said, "Don't covet," he was telling Israel that they were his people and his alone. So God's grace is always prior, and even in the Old Testament it was grace, and even right before the law it was grace. The law itself is a form of grace. And so the question, the biggest question for us isn't, do we follow the law? It is important because the law does search our hearts, but it's, are you following Jesus? Jesus is the new Moses who leads us out of sin and death. And so the important question is, are you on your way out of Egypt? Are you on your way out of sin? Are you following Jesus? And when you follow God, he gives you the grace to follow him. His grace is always prior. It's always been his grace. The first scene in the first scene after sin entered the world isn't man seeking God, but it's God seeking men. After Adam and Eve sinned, God was in the garden, and it wasn't Adam calling out to God, it was God calling out to Adam. So before we ever seek God, God's seeking us. Before we ever call out to God, God's calling us. And before we ever love God, he was loving us.